Caligula executed thousands of Romans in the arena, drowned senators in baths, and forced fathers to watch their sons die. But the one person he truly loved, the emperor, killed in complete secrecy. His sister Drusilla died under mysterious circumstances, and her death remains one of the most puzzling pages in Roman Empire history. Modern historians call this the paradox of cruelty. The closer the victim to the tyrant, the more elaborate the method of destruction becomes. Public executions were meant to terrorize the people, but intimate murders served entirely different purposes. We live in an era when family tyrants once again determine the fate of entire nations. From North Korea to Syria, from criminal clans to corporate dynasties, the mechanisms of power within families remain the same as they were 2,000 years ago. Studying the relationship between Caligula and Drusilla gives us a key to understanding modern dictatorships, where family ties become simultaneously a source of strength and a deadly threat. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known as Caligula, ruled the Roman Empire for just 3 years and 10 months from 37 to 41 AD. In this brief period, he managed to squander the colossal inheritance left by his predecessor Tiberius, launch meaningless wars, and transform the imperial palace into a place of continuous terror. Ancient historians Suetonius, Dio Cassius, and Josephus left us detailed descriptions of his madness, but all write surprisingly little about Drusilla's death. Julia Drusilla was born in 16 AD and was the second of 3 sisters to the future emperor. Her name came from the famous general Drusus, her paternal grandfather, emphasizing her high status in the imperial family. Unlike other women of her time, Caligula's sisters received exceptional privileges: the right to attend the Senate, participate in religious ceremonies, and influence official appointments. Ancient sources unanimously note the special relationship between Caligula and Drusilla, which contemporaries called not just closeness, but obsession. Suetonius directly writes about an incestuous connection, noting that the emperor lived with all his sisters as with wives, but loved Drusilla more than the others. Dio Cassius adds details about their joint public appearances, where Drusilla occupied the place intended for an empress. Modern historiography treats accusations of incest cautiously, considering them part of anti-Caligula propaganda developed after his assassination. However, even skeptically minded researchers acknowledge Drusilla's exceptional role in the empire's political life. Professor of Ancient History Mary Beard from Cambridge University notes, regardless of the nature of their personal relationship, Drusilla was the only person capable of influencing Caligula's decisions in state matters. After coming to power, Caligula officially included Drusilla in the oath of allegiance that Roman citizens took. Her name appeared in official documents alongside the emperor's name, which had no precedent in Roman history. Coins from that period show the profiles of brother and sister in equal positions, symbolic equality that contemporaries perceived as a sign of coming changes in the empire's structure. Drusilla's influence manifested in key appointments and dismissals of high officials. Praetorian prefect Macro, who helped Caligula come to power, was removed precisely at her insistence. Consular appointments in 37 also bore the mark of her preferences. This created a special atmosphere at court, where courtiers were forced to consider the opinion not only of the emperor, but also of his sister. In the summer of 38 AD, less than a year after Caligula began his reign, Drusilla suddenly died. The official cause was fever that lasted several days. However, details of her final days raise serious suspicions among modern researchers. Unlike other deaths in the imperial family, which were accompanied by detailed medical descriptions and witness testimonies, Drusilla's demise is shrouded in strange silence from the sources. Caligula's reaction to his sister's death exceeded all Roman concepts of mourning rituals. He declared Drusilla a goddess, established a cult in her honor, built temples, and appointed priests. Moreover, the emperor left Rome for several months, which was an unprecedented act for a ruler in peacetime. Many historians interpret this departure from the capital as flight from a crime scene or an attempt to hide evidence. Comparing the circumstances of Drusilla's death with the fates of Caligula's other victims reveals striking differences. The emperor never hid his crimes. On the contrary, he demonstrated cruelty as a tool of governance. Public executions, elaborate tortures, humiliations in front of crowds, all this was part of political spectacle. The secret death of his beloved sister completely doesn't fit this pattern of behavior. Drusilla was not an ordinary Roman matron content with the role of decoration at the imperial court. She represented a new type of woman politician, capable of competing with men in the struggle for power. And it was precisely this quality that made her simultaneously indispensable to Caligula and deadly dangerous. Ancient sources paint a portrait of a woman of exceptional intelligence and ambition. Dio Cassius notes that Drusilla possessed sharpness of mind, exceeding most men in the Senate. Tacitus, though writing about her with obvious dislike, acknowledges her ability to see the political consequences of decisions several moves ahead. Modern historians compare her influence to the role of Livia under Augustus or Agrippina under Claudius women, who actually ruled the empire from behind the scenes. The upbringing of Caligula's sisters differed radically from traditional female education of that time. Their mother, Agrippina the Elder, Augustus's granddaughter, deliberately prepared her daughters for political activity. The girls studied rhetoric alongside their brothers, attended discussions of state affairs, and gained knowledge in military art and diplomacy. This education formed in Drusilla an understanding of power mechanisms that most Roman women lacked. After their father Germanicus died in 19 AD, the family found itself at the center of political intrigues. Agrippina the Elder openly accused Emperor Tiberius of poisoning her husband, creating an atmosphere of constant danger. Germanicus's children grew up understanding that their lives depended on their ability to correctly assess the intentions and motives of those around them. Drusilla particularly well absorbed these lessons of survival at court. Contemporaries noted Drusilla's ability to read the political situation with stunning accuracy. When in 31 Tiberius began repressions against Germanicus's family, it was she who advised Caligula to demonstratively distance himself from his mother and brothers. This painful choice saved the future emperor from the fate of relatives who died in prisons or were exiled to islands. Drusilla understood. In politics, survival is more important than family loyalty. Drusilla's marriage to Lucius Cassius Longinus in 33 was purely political in nature. Longinus belonged to an ancient patrician family and possessed significant influence in the Senate. However, contemporaries noted that the spouses lived essentially separately, meeting only at official ceremonies. Drusilla's true partner in political affairs remained her brother Caligula, which generated numerous rumors and gossip at court. Accusations of an incestuous relationship between brother and sister are viewed by modern historians in the context of Roman political culture. Such accusations were a standard way of discrediting political opponents. Octavian Augustus was also accused of relations with his daughter Julia, Tiberius with his daughter-in-law, Livilla. Professor Christopher Kelly from Cambridge University notes, incest was a universal political accusation that required no proof but inflicted irreparable damage to reputation. However, even skeptically minded researchers acknowledge the extraordinary closeness of Caligula and Drusilla. Their relationship went beyond ordinary brother-sister attachment and approached political partnership. Archaeological finds in Pompeii include graffiti mentioning the divine pair Caligula and Drusilla, which testifies to their contemporaries' perception of them as a unified whole. After Caligula came to power, Drusilla's role in governing the empire became open and official. The emperor included her name in the oath of loyalty taken by provincial governors and legions. No woman in Roman history had been granted such honor. Even wives of previous emperors did not possess such status. This decision caused outrage among the senatorial aristocracy, but Caligula ignored the protests. Drusilla received the right to mint her own coins with her profile and titles approaching imperial status. On gold ore from 37, her face is depicted in a laurel wreath, a symbol of triumph that traditionally belonged only to victorious generals. The inscription read, Julia Drusilla Augusta, a title previously held only by emperors' wives, and even then, posthumously. Drusilla's influence on Caligula's personnel decisions is documented by papyri from Egypt and inscriptions from other provinces. Egypt's prefect Avilius Flaccus was dismissed at her direct instruction after a conflict with Alexandrian merchants who enjoyed the emperor's sister's patronage. Syria's governor Lucius Vitellius received his appointment thanks to Drusilla's recommendation, as she saw him as a counterbalance to Parthian king influence. Contemporaries noted Drusilla's ability to find compromises in complex political situations where Caligula demonstrated only cruelty or whims. When the emperor decided to declare war on Britain due to personal offense against one of the British chiefs, it was Drusilla who convinced him to limit himself to demonstrative exercises on the English Channel coast. This operation, known as the War with Neptune, became a compromise between imperial ambitions and common sense. The political partnership between brother and sister was particularly evident in religious policy. Caligula sought deification during his lifetime, but understood the resistance of traditionally minded Romans. Drusilla proposed a more subtle strategy. Begin with eastern provinces, where ruler cult had ancient roots, then gradually spread it westward. Temples of Caligula and Drusilla appeared first in Egypt and Syria, then in Greece, and only lastly in Rome itself. However, Drusilla's exceptional position also created serious problems. Senators perceived her influence as a threat to traditional order, where women did not participate openly in politics. Praetorian prefect Macro, who helped Caligula come to power, was removed precisely after conflict with Drusilla. She believed that praetorians should obey the imperial family directly, not commanders from senatorial class. On June 10, 38 AD, an event occurred in Rome that ancient historians describe surprisingly sparingly. Drusilla, who had participated in an imperial council meeting just the day before, suddenly fell ill with fever. 4 days later, the empire's most influential woman was dead. The official version sounded simple: acute illness, rapid deterioration, death despite the efforts of Rome's best physicians. But the devil lies in details that ancient sources either suppress or present in distorted form. Suetonius, who usually describes deaths of imperial family members in detail, devotes only a few lines to Drusilla's demise. Dio Cassius mentions sudden illness, but provides no medical details. Tacitus, whose annals contain detailed descriptions of poisonings and murders of that time, completely avoids this topic in silence. Such sparse coverage seems suspicious, given Drusilla's status in Roman society. Deaths of imperial relatives traditionally were accompanied by detailed medical reports, witness testimonies, descriptions of last words, and dying wishes. When Tiberius Gemellus, the previous emperor's grandson, died 2 years later, ancient historians provided numerous details of his agony, including exact timing of illness onset and symptoms of poisoning. Modern analysis of available sources reveals several troubling inconsistencies in the official version of Drusilla's death. First, the timing of her illness coincides with a period of escalating conflicts between Caligula and the Senate over excessive spending on construction and games. Drusilla actively supported her brother's policies, making her a target for dissatisfied aristocrats. Second, illness symptoms described in later sources correspond to arsenic poisoning, a popular method of eliminating political opponents in the ancient world. Professor of toxicology John Snow from the University of London, who studied poisoning methods in antiquity, notes, "The description of Drusilla's illness, high fever, vomiting, convulsions, rapid death completely corresponds to acute poisoning by arsenic compounds. In the 1st century AD, this was the most common method of eliminating unwanted persons at the imperial court." The location of Drusilla's death also raises questions. She died not in the imperial palace on the Palatine where she lived permanently, but at a villa outside the city where she had supposedly gone for rest. This villa belonged to Aemilius Lepidus, Drusilla's third husband, who was known for his connections with senatorial opposition. After his wife's death, Lepidus unexpectedly quickly left Rome and embarked on a long journey through eastern provinces' behavior that can be interpreted as flight from possible accusations. Caligula's own reaction to his sister's death exceeded all Roman concepts of mourning. The emperor declared state mourning for 30 days, a period usually declared only after the death of ruling emperors. All theaters and circuses were closed, public baths sealed, Trade in the forum suspended. Caligula personally forbade citizens from laughing, singing, or attending banquets until the mourning period ended. Violators were punished with fines, and in cases of repeat violations, with imprisonment. Moreover, Caligula committed an unprecedented act. He left Rome for 3 months, transferring empire management to the Praetorian prefect. No Roman emperor before had left the capital in peacetime for such an extended period. Officially, Caligula departed to pay respects to his sister's tomb and perform necessary religious rites. But contemporaries interpreted this departure as a sign of guilt or fear of investigation into Drusilla's death circumstances. Comparison with Caligula's other victims shows cardinal differences in murder methods. The emperor never hid his crimes, on the contrary. He turned executions into public spectacles. When Caligula ordered the killing of his cousin Tiberius Gemellus, the execution took place before senators' eyes in the Curia. Praetorian prefect Macro was forced to commit suicide publicly, in the presence of witnesses. Dozens of other victims died in circus arenas or were thrown from the Tarpeian Rock with large crowds present. The secret death of his beloved sister completely doesn't fit this behavioral pattern. If Caligula really killed Drusilla, he did it secretly for the only time in his life. This fact suggests either third-party participation in the murder or special motives that required secrecy. Archaeological data add intriguing details to the mystery of Drusilla's death. During excavations of Aemilius Lepidus's villa in the 1950s, archaeologists discovered remains of a laboratory where poisons could have been manufactured. Found vessels contained traces of arsenic sulfide, a substance called inheritance of kings in antiquity, due to frequent use in palace intrigues. Radiocarbon dating showed the laboratory functioned precisely in the 30s AD. The behavior of Caligula's other sisters after Drusilla's death also provokes thought. Agrippina the Younger and Livilla, who had previously competed with Drusilla for influence over their brother, suddenly became demonstratively loyal and submissive. They stopped participating in political intrigues, limited themselves to ritual functions, and avoided any actions that might arouse the emperor's suspicions. Such behavior can be explained by fear of repeating their sister's fate. The appointment of a new Praetorian prefect immediately after Drusilla's death looks particularly suspicious. Caligula chose Cassius Chaerea, an officer known for his dislike of female influence in politics. Chaerea repeatedly spoke against the participation of the emperor's sisters in state affairs, calling it corruption of Roman traditions. His appointment could have been either a reward for eliminating Drusilla or Caligula's attempt to find an ally among those dissatisfied with her influence. Medical aspects of Drusilla's death raise additional questions upon detailed examination. The clinical picture described in sources sudden onset, high fever, gastrointestinal disorders. Rapid death indeed corresponds to acute poisoning. However, in the 1st century AD, there were many infectious diseases with similar symptoms. Typhus, dysentery, malaria, plague. Professor of Ancient Medicine Helen King from the Open University of Britain notes, differential diagnosis in antiquity was extremely limited. What Roman physicians called acute fever could have been dozens of different diseases. However, the speed of Drusilla's illness development and absence of similar cases among her entourage point rather to poisoning than infection. Why might Caligula have killed the only person he truly loved? This question has tormented historians for 2 millennia. The answer lies in understanding the nature of absolute power, where love and hatred intertwine so closely that they become indistinguishable. Drusilla represented for her brother simultaneously support and threat, source of strength and weakness, ideal ally and potential rival. The first motive is rooted in the political logic of imperial power. By summer of 38, Drusilla's influence on state affairs had become so obvious that senators openly spoke of dual rule. Roman tradition categorically rejected female participation in state governance. Even Livia, Augustus's wife, exercised her influence secretly through a system of patronage and recommendations. Drusilla acted openly, creating a dangerous precedent. Modern research shows that in 38, a conspiracy of senators dissatisfied with Caligula's extravagance and disregard for traditions was brewing. The main irritant for conspirators was precisely Drusilla's role in decision-making. A papyrus from Oxyrhynchus, discovered in 1923, contains a fragment of a letter from an unknown senator. As long as this woman whispers in his ear, the empire will never return to ancestral order. Professor Catherine Steele from Yale University, specialist in late Roman Republic political culture, explains, Caligula may have understood that Drusilla had become his Achilles' heel. Opponents used her influence to discredit the emperor, presenting him as a weak ruler under female control. In Roman political coordinates, this was a deadly accusation. The second motive relates to dynastic considerations. Drusilla had no children from 3 marriages, which in antiquity was perceived either as divine curse or conscious decision to avoid maternal duties for political career. The sisters' childlessness created a serious problem for Caligula. Who would inherit her influence and wealth after death? Roman law did not provide for transfer of political powers from woman to woman, but men in the family could not claim the role Drusilla played. Particularly painful for Caligula was the question of his sister's possible marriage to an influential politician. Her third husband, Aemilius Lepidus, belonged to an ancient patrician family and had his own ambitions. Contemporaries noted that Lepidus looked at imperial purple with unconcealed lust. Drusilla's alliance with an ambitious aristocrat could create an alternative center of power within the imperial family. Ancient sources contain hints of conflict between Caligula and Lepidus, precisely regarding Drusilla's role in state affairs. Suetonius mentions sharp disputes between the emperor and his brother-in-law in spring of 38. Dio Cassius writes of Lepidus's inappropriate ambitions, who allegedly demanded consular powers for himself as the emperor's sister's husband. These conflicts could have convinced Caligula that Drusilla had become an instrument of others' political games. The third motive is psychological in nature and relates to Caligula's personality traits. Modern psychiatry diagnoses him with signs of narcissistic personality disorder with paranoid elements. People with such diagnosis experience pathological need for control over others, especially over those they consider theirs. The closer the person, the stronger the desire to completely subordinate them to one's will. Dr. Christopher Ferguson, professor of psychology at the University of Texas, who studied psychopathology of historical dictators, notes, tyrants often kill precisely those they love most because closeness breeds fear of losing control. Caligula may have perceived Drusilla's independence as personal betrayal, requiring extreme punishment measures. Caligula's behavior toward other close people confirms this psychological model. He executed his adopted son Tiberius Gemellus immediately after he reached adulthood and gained right to independent political action. Praetorian prefect Macro, who helped him come to power, was eliminated when he began giving advice on state governance. Drusilla could have become victim of the same logic. Her influence and independence turned into threat to imperial ego. The fourth motive relates to Caligula's religious beliefs about his own divinity. The emperor seriously believed in his supernatural origin and demanded appropriate worship from subjects. Drusilla was the only person who treated him as an ordinary mortal, the brother with whom she grew up. Her familiarity could have been perceived by Caligula as sacrilege, requiring punishment. A papyrus from the University of Michigan collection contains a fragment of a contemporary's letter. Divine Gaius demands that even his sister address him with genuflection. But Drusilla continues calling him by his childhood name and laughs at his claims to immortality. If this document is authentic, it explains religious motives for possible conflict between brother and sister. Economic motives should also not be excluded from consideration. Drusilla controlled a significant portion of imperial finances, including revenues from eastern provinces and trade duties on Egyptian grain. By 38, Caligula's wasteful policies had led to serious budget crisis. The emperor needed additional funds to continue construction projects and organize games for the people. Drusilla's death automatically transferred all her wealth to the emperor's disposal. Ancient sources estimate her personal fortune at 200 million sestertii, a sum sufficient to maintain 4 legions for a year. These funds allowed Caligula to continue populist policies and postpone painful tax reforms. The fifth motive is rooted in the fear management strategy actively used by Caligula. Public executions of senators and military leaders demonstrated the emperor's power to people, but didn't affect him personally. Murder of his own sister, even secret, sent a completely different signal. If the emperor is ready to destroy his closest person, then no one can feel safe. The reaction of the two other sisters, Agrippina and Livilla, confirms the effectiveness of this strategy. After Drusilla's death, they completely ceased any attempts to influence their brother's policies, contenting themselves with ceremonial functions. Their submission was so demonstrative that contemporaries interpreted it as fear of repeating their older sister's fate. Finally, the impulsive nature of the decision to kill Drusilla cannot be excluded. Caligula was known for sudden fits of rage and ill-considered actions. Perhaps the murder occurred as a result of acute conflict, when the emperor acted under emotional influence rather than rational calculation. Subsequent remorse and excessive mourning could have been attempts to atone for impulsive crime. History is full of beautiful legends about the great love that supposedly connected Caligula with his sister Drusilla. The romantic version of their relationship has penetrated popular culture, spawning myths that distort historical reality. It's time to debunk these delusions and look at alternative versions of events based on critical analysis of sources. The first myth claims that Caligula and Drusilla were connected by true love that overcame social prohibitions and political considerations. This romantic interpretation ignores the fundamental principle of Roman aristocracy. Personal feelings always submitted to political advantage. Modern historians convincingly prove that the relationship between brother and sister represented primarily strategic alliance. Professor Mary Beard from Cambridge University notes, "The notion of romantic love between Caligula and Drusilla appeared in Renaissance literature and has no solid foundation in ancient sources. Roman historians wrote about political partnership that contemporaries interpreted through the lens of family relations accepted in the Imperial dynasty. Accusations of incest should be viewed in the context of Roman political rhetoric. Such accusations were a standard way of discrediting unwanted rulers. Octavian Augustus was accused of relations with daughters and granddaughters, Tiberius with daughters-in-law and nieces, Claudius with niece Agrippina. None of these accusations was proven, but all were actively used by political opponents. The second myth concerns the causes of Drusilla's death. The popular version claims she died of natural causes, fever or infectious disease common in ancient Rome. This interpretation is based on literal reading of official reports, not considering political context and motives for possible falsification. Modern analysis of the epidemiological situation in Rome of 38 shows absence of mass outbreaks of infectious diseases during this period. City records contain no mentions of increased mortality or quarantine measures. If Drusilla really died from infection, her illness was an isolated case, which is statistically unlikely for diseases capable of killing a healthy person in 4 days. Dr. Robert Salloway, specialist in ancient epidemiology from Princeton University, emphasizes, "The clinical picture of Drusilla's illness corresponds to none of the known infectious diseases of that time. Rapid symptom development and absence of secondary cases among her entourage point to non-infectious nature of death." The third myth claims that Caligula was so shocked by his sister's death that he lost his mind and began behaving even more cruelly and unpredictably. According to this version, the emperor's assassination by conspirators in 41 became direct consequence of his grief-induced madness after losing Drusilla. However, chronological analysis of Caligula's actions doesn't confirm radical changes in his behavior after his sister's death. The emperor's cruelty and capriciousness manifested from the first months of his reign, long before Drusilla's demise. Mass executions of senators, extravagance, religious innovations, all these features of his policy were obvious already in 37. His sister's death might have intensified existing tendencies, but didn't create them. The fourth myth concerns the role of Caligula's other sisters in Drusilla's possible murder. Some modern interpretations present Agrippina the Younger and Livilla as rivals who might have organized elimination of their more influential sister. This version is based on late sources and ignores the real balance of power at court. Agrippina and Livilla in 38 didn't possess sufficient resources and connections to organize murder. their political influence was minimal compared to Drusilla's positions. Moreover, eliminating their older sister didn't guarantee them strengthening of their own positions, rather the opposite. It demonstrated to Caligula the danger of female participation in politics. Professor Judith Hallett from the University of Maryland, specialist in women in Roman politics, explains, Caligula's sisters acted not as independent political players, but as instruments of dynastic politics. Their rivalry was ceremonial in nature and didn't reach the level of deadly enmity. An alternative version of events suggests senatorial opposition's participation in Drusilla's murder. By 38, the emperor's sister's influence on state affairs caused open dissatisfaction among aristocrats. Eliminating Drusilla could have been the first step in a broader conspiracy against Caligula himself. This hypothesis explains several mysterious circumstances. First, the place of death Aemilius Lepidus's villa, who had connections with senatorial opposition. Second, Lepidus's quick departure from Rome after his wife's death. Third, the appointment of Cassius Chaerea as Praetorian prefect, an officer known for dislike of female influence in politics. Archaeological finds at Lepidus's villa confirm the possibility of this version. The laboratory for poison manufacturing discovered there could have been used by conspirators. Arsenic sulfide, traces of which were found in vessels, was a popular means of political murders in antiquity. Its advantage was ability to mimic symptoms of natural diseases. The second alternative version suggests that Drusilla was killed on Caligula's own orders, but not impulsively, rather as a result of carefully planned operation. The emperor might have understood that his sister's influence had become obstacle to realizing his political and religious plans. Secret murder allowed eliminating the problem while avoiding open conflict with her supporters. This version explains Caligula's strange reaction to his sister's death. Excessive mourning and deification of Drusilla could have been attempts to hide his own guilt and rewrite the history of their relationship. By turning his dead sister into a goddess, the emperor simultaneously got rid of political competitor and created new instrument of power legitimation. The third alternative version considers possibility of Drusilla's suicide. In Roman culture, suicide of noble women was not rare, especially in situations of political crisis. Drusilla might have understood that her influence had become burden for her brother and voluntarily left life so as not to create additional problems for him. However, this version poorly agrees with Drusilla's character, who throughout life demonstrated active life position and striving for power. Contemporaries didn't note signs of depression or disappointment in politics in her. Moreover, suicide doesn't explain the secrecy that surrounded her final stay at Lepidus's villa. The fourth alternative version suggests participation of Eastern courtiers in Drusilla's murder. Caligula's sister actively maintained connections with rulers of eastern provinces and might have become victim of their intrigues. Parthian or Egyptian agents might have seen her as obstacle to their plans of influencing Roman politics. This exotic version has weak evidence, but cannot be completely excluded. In the 1st century AD, Eastern kingdoms actively interfered in Roman internal politics through bribery, blackmail, and elimination of unwanted persons. Drusilla controlled trade relations with the East and might have hindered someone's commercial or political interests. Drusilla's death became a turning point not only in Caligula's life, but in the history of the Roman Empire itself. What happened after June 10th, 38 AD, transformed an eccentric but relatively manageable ruler into a paranoid tyrant whose actions hastened the collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Analysis of the consequences of this mysterious death reveals universal mechanisms of power that remain relevant in the modern world. The first signs of cardinal changes in Caligula's behavior appeared immediately after the end of official mourning for his sister. If previously the emperor, despite all his oddities, maintained the appearance of consultations with the Senate and respect for traditions, then in autumn of 38, he moved to openly despotic rule. Decisions were made unilaterally, without discussion with advisors. Senate sessions became formality, where only technical details of decisions already made by the emperor were discussed. Changes in religious policy became particularly striking. Before Drusilla's death, Caligula was content with honors traditionally accorded emperor statues, altars, sacrifices. After her demise, He demanded direct worship as living God. In the temple of Castor and Pollux in the Forum, his gigantic statue was installed, before which citizens had to perform daily prayers. Refusal to worship was punished by death. Modern psychologists interpret these changes as classic mechanism of guilt compensation. Martin Seligman from the University of Pennsylvania, specialist in post-traumatic stress in historical figures, explains, if Caligula really was involved in Drusilla's death, his subsequent behavior demonstrates typical reaction to suppressed guilt feelings, grandiosity, demands for absolute submission, paranoia. All these are ways the psyche protects itself from unbearable awareness of committed crime. Deification of dead Drusilla became the central element of new religious policy. Caligula declared his sister goddess Panthea patroness of all other deities. Temples were built in her honor, priests appointed, monthly festivals arranged. Drusilla's cult was to become mandatory for all empire inhabitants, including conquered peoples of eastern provinces. This religious revolution had deep political consequences. Traditional Roman religion was based on contract between gods and state, where emperor served as chief priest but not deity. The demand for direct worship broke this system and created fundamentally new model of relations between power and society. Romans were to transform from citizens into subjects of living God. Resistance to new religious policy led to mass repressions. The number of political executions after Drusilla's death increased several times. If in the first year of rule, Caligula executed on average 2 to 3 senators per month, then in the second half of 38, this number rose to 10 to 12. Moreover, executions became more cruel and public. The emperor clearly sought to intimidate potential opponents. Economic consequences of Drusilla's death proved no less dramatic. The emperor's sister was known for relative moderation in spending and ability to find compromises between populist demands of the people and fiscal possibilities of the state. After her death, Caligula completely lost sense of measure in spending state funds. Temple construction in Drusilla's honor required colossal expenses. Only the main temple of goddess Panthea in Rome cost the treasury 50 million sestertii, a sum sufficient to maintain 2 legions for a year. Similar temples were built in every province, creating unbearable burden on imperial finances. By the end of 38, budget crisis reached critical point. Caligula was forced to introduce emergency taxes, confiscate property of wealthy citizens, sell state lands. These measures caused dissatisfaction among all social layers, from senatorial aristocracy to urban craftsmen. Economic chaos became one of main causes of the conspiracy that led to the emperor's murder in 41. International consequences of Drusilla's death also proved significant. The emperor's sister maintained active diplomatic correspondence with rulers of eastern kingdoms and played an important role in settling border conflicts. Her death disrupted the established system of relations and led to situation deterioration on Eastern Empire borders. Parthian king Artabanus III, who previously coordinated his actions with Drusilla, began active expansion in Mesopotamia after her death. The Armenian question, which seemed settled thanks to her diplomatic efforts, became acute again. Nabatean Arabs resumed raids on Syrian provinces. All these conflicts required military intervention and additional expenses. The influence of Drusilla's death on other imperial family members was deep and long-lasting. Agrippina the Younger and Livilla, who after their sister's demise demonstrated complete submission to their brother, secretly began preparing for survival struggle. It was during this period that Agrippina established connections with future conspirators and began forming alternative court grouping. Fear of repeating Drusilla's fate forced other sisters to radically change their behavioral strategy. They stopped openly participating in politics, concentrated on charity and religious ceremonies, avoided any actions that might arouse the emperor's suspicions. However, under the mask of submission, active preparation for possible confrontation was hidden. Modern historians see in Drusilla's death the beginning of process that led to the collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Professor Ronald Syme from Oxford University notes, by removing the only person capable of restraining his worst impulses, Caligula launched mechanism of self-destruction. Subsequent emperors of this dynasty, Claudius and Nero, inherited model of family relations where murdering relatives became norm of political struggle. Modern parallels with family dictatorships show universality of mechanisms launched by Drusilla's death. From the Kim dynasty in North Korea to the Assad family in Syria, everywhere we see similar behavioral patterns. Elimination of influential relative who could serve as restraining factor inevitably leads to escalation of repressions and increased dictator isolation. Psychological mechanisms manifested in Caligula after his sister's death are characteristic of all authoritarian leaders who committed crimes against close ones. Guilt feelings transform into aggression against others. Paranoia intensifies due to fear of exposure. Need for absolute control increases as compensation for loss of self-control. The lesson of Drusilla's death is relevant for modern corporate culture too. Leaders who eliminate critically minded but loyal employees often face similar consequences. Disappearance of internal opposition leads to making catastrophically wrong decisions, leader isolation from reality, degradation of entire organization. History shows that the most dangerous tyrants are not those who kill enemies, but those who destroy friends. Enemies are predictable in their hostility, while friends are capable of telling truth and preventing catastrophe. Caligula, depriving himself of the only person who could influence his decisions, transformed from eccentric but manageable ruler into mad despot. The mystery of Drusilla's death still excites historians and writers' minds. But the main lesson of this story is not who and how killed the emperor's sister, but what consequences this murder had for the entire Roman Empire. When power loses internal restraining mechanisms, it inevitably self-destructs, and this principle remains unchanged throughout millennia. Perhaps this is precisely why Drusilla's death was shrouded in such secrecy. Caligula understood that murdering his only close person would become point of no return, after which only path into abyss awaited him. And he was right. 2.5 years after his sister's death, the emperor himself was stabbed by conspirators in an underground passage of his palace.